Today's podcast guest is the founder of Critical Equity Consulting LLC, a boutique organizational justice consulting firm focused on helping organizations rebuild with a primary focus on creating equitable outcomes and seeking justice. Farzad is an organizational justice practitioner that holds 2 master's degrees in international affairs and diplomacy. He leverages his unique academic background, extensive travel experience, and experiential knowledge to provide comprehensive, thought-provoking, local and global approaches to his work. Farzin is also a seasoned project manager with expertise in developing strategies that build equitable workplace environments and government services, as well as build internal capacity. He has an extensive background in human rights, social justice, and DEI. So she had posted something about how white men are the solution to our DEI efforts. And so you said all the white dudes are gonna save us, and I thought about it. Initially, I laughed. But then I deleted that comment, and then I thought about it a lot more, and then I was like, they have the power, right? And this is also coming from another person that happens to be in the space as well. I think you might follow her, she might follow you, and she had mentioned to me that we shouldn't place the burden on survivors and victims of employment discrimination to seek accountability. They've already gone through so much. They have dealt with it. I usually encourage them to speak up and advocate for themselves and things of that nature. Whereas she's like, we can't really push this on the victim and the survivors. And I'm like,
sure.
Then who else is going to do it? If we don't have the people, in history, the only people that have ever risen are the oppressed. It's never been the oppressors like, okay, let's change the dynamics of things and let us give away the power that the system provides for us, so that way we can make everybody else feel included. It's never happened. It's never going to happen. So I guess I'll start off with that. It's a good question. Yeah. What do you think about when with that post about how white men might be the solution to solving our DEI, processes within organizational systems?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, and it's I found it a little funny myself. I was like, this is a little silly. This kind of reeks of saviorism, and nobody needs other people to kind of people in position of power to save them, right? It's not a so there's this balance between those individuals who are in positions of power, historically over centuries, and have accumulated that power and sit in comfort in that power. They don't have the, emotional pain and labor and mental anguish of centuries of oppression. So they have more energy to kind of put into the work, and also they are in positions of where that they're of an influence, right? They can change things a lot better. Like power gives you the ability to enact greater change as specifically as an individual, and then groups vis-a-vis others, right? That's the whole purpose of power. The problem is that that we talk a lot about the fragility of power, about the quote unquote blindness of power. You sit in a position, you don't see the troubles of others, and you don't experience it, and you're less likely to believe it. And so you only go so far as listening to the point that it doesn't challenge your own power. I'll do enough, but but I don't want anything that any of my comforts challenged. So even liberals do this. You have NIMBYism in a lot of liberal communities. Not in my backyard. Especially I've done work on racial justice in communities, and race equity in communities. And so for example, housing policy, there's some of the biggest sort of resistors in those communities are actually liberals, right? Because they've grown to sit in a position of power. They will say, oh yeah, I don't like discrimination, or I don't like racism, but there's a trade-off. So how do you bridge that? Like, so the people who are oppressed simultaneously have to live in that oppression, which takes a lot of emotional labor, and then have to free themselves, which takes an extra amount of emotional labor. The people in power don't want to give up their power, but also like have a responsibility to do something with that power. Like Spider-Man's uncle, talks about great power, and that's not. It's true though. Like,
yeah.
So that's why I kind of stopped so much talking about like inclusion as much as developing mechanisms for communal power, right? So this so inclusion still is from a position of those, as this post says, those it is a softer type of saviorism essentially. So those with power provide things to people without power, right? It's still a power dynamic. It's still I'm not challenging the structure. I'm just kind of like being nicer about it, being nicer about my power.
Right.
Whereas what I talk about these days is like for all of our communities, the communities that we sit in, that have been, on a global scale, actually, not just like in the U.S. framework. I talk a lot about things in a global context. Those have been like horned and marginalized and hurt and killed, and over time. They deserve some degree of power to represent themselves as communities. So, like, and that community one addresses the problem of individual emotional labor. So you find camaraderie in your group, and you're able to kind of accumulate power to be able to challenge those structures. And two, it doesn't rely on those individuals to kind of hey, this is what I need, and then you give that back to me, but through your lens, through your specific framework. Like, you're only going to give me what you think is appropriate, not what I need, right? Who knows better what I need than me in my community, right? So, so I think like stuff like that, it's a nice interim, right? It's like, you have like really strict, harmful authoritarianism on one end, and you have pure democracy and like absolute like power distribution on the other end. There's a middle ground of nicer authoritarians, and that's where a lot of DEI sits, right? It's a lot of like, hey, it's focused on leadership, it's focused on those with power providing, as opposed to us trying to figure out how we can distribute and accumulate power amongst our own communities to represent ourselves better. And so like, there are different schools. I mean, there's a very liberal framework, right? The liberal framework is about just, being more gentle, but not dismantling the structures that oppress us. It's just like, hey, I'm teaching you how to be a better citizen, as opposed to for those with power, as opposed to or how to steward your power more effectively and in a more meaningful way. And that only goes so far. I mean, as soon as something happens, or as soon as that power is checked, or as soon as a recession hits or anything like that, all that goes out the window and you revert back to that system. So that's why I was like, okay, this is exactly the opposite of where we're hoping to kind of take a lot of the DEI world. And that's why long-winded answer, but that's,
Yeah, and I think it kind of, it definitely drives another question. And you kind of talk about communal power, and, recently you had posted something on LinkedIn with respect to the concept of leadership, and that you felt it was absurd. What are your thoughts on, like, I guess when it comes to leadership and the type of thought processes that are kind of built around it within organizational structures versus what you think might be a better option?
I think like purely the word leadership is agnostic. I don't think there's a lot of like, it can go either way, right? What I take kind of what I protest against is the idea of like this individualistic type of leadership where like one person kind of is going to save us all, and like kind of this like saviorist image of the business, the business leader like Bezos, Musk, or anybody that's going to save the world or save like supply chains, even like like anything like that.
Right.
So my post was about like if we sort of remove that ingrained association of leadership with power, authority, and individualism, what we have left actually is emergence. And what we really want is folks to be able to notice things and see things and have fresh ideas and new ideas, and us being able to kind of work through them. Like, oh yeah, in that context, leadership then becomes less of an individualistic endeavor, like this one person is driving it, where we can, as groups, kind of take our own forms of leadership. Like, it's not fixed anymore. Somebody can lead on a project because they've had the experience, they've had the expertise, they have the ideas, and they have a vision and stuff like that. And people give a little bit of power to them to be able to enact it. So like and that's a voluntary act. Whereas leadership in a position, in a role that is fixed, is not challengeable. It's not dynamic. So there's a lot of emerging sort of office, decision making kind of processes. Like you hear about Teal, you hear about sociocracy, that are kind of challenging this like fixed position of leadership. It's like this. It's not a. Leader's not a job. Right. It's a construct. It's an idea. It's like, you lead on something. So it's more fluid. And I think that ends up having much better results than appointing a position. And then, that person is tasked with having to have some degree of expertise and knowledge in literally everything, which is impossible. And then, or like if they don't have, they consult, right? They have a consultative process, and they still get credit for it anyway, right? And so it is unsustainable. It is like we're past all of this. Like this type of hierarchical leadership model is great if you want to develop a highly extractive form of capitalism and grow extremely fast, like command and control. That's good for hyper exploitation. But for arrangements where we want to kind of collaborate and synergize, diffusing some of that power and providing opportunities for multiple nodes of leadership, I think is. But at this point, like, I mean, how can you even suggest that? Because the term leadership has been so like warped by so much of the business consulting side of it. Like everything is leadership. You go on LinkedIn, it's like, okay, why aren't we talking about collaboration and shared decision making and emergent thought and group planning through things and finding solutions on multiple areas? Last thing I'll say to that is that the DEI world has also fallen victim to this, right? Like it's if one person can know everything about every identity and every ethnic group and every culture on this planet, right? Why don't we all represent ourselves in the workplace as opposed to appointing somebody to know about me,
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, that's and I guess a lot of people would probably argue that, and I think what you kind of said here, which kind of makes sense to me, is that a lot of these hierarchical structures are kind of situated in a way which they kind of lead to hyper exploitation and more like short-term profits, quicker results, just moves things a lot quicker. Just like I guess the thought process is that they look at armies, right, military as the model, the institutionalized model of like getting things done. Like leadership really stems in many ways from that, right? I mean, you look at history, you look at Rome, you look at any of those structures that have demonstrated that, oh, this is what leadership is. Let's get things done fast, effectively, no questions asked, move forward in that direction. So I like this idea. And so I guess from what you're kind of saying here is that a lot of the way DEI is really what it's really meant to do, in light of how leadership structures are being pushed upon these models that exist, do you feel like that leadership and DEI are actually at crossroads in the way that things exist? Because you feel as if there should be more of a collaborative, more of an authentic model that kind of demonstrates equality and opportunity for all people. Is that kind of what I'm understanding?
Yeah. So I think like it. I have my theories as to why DEI is this way. Like,
Right.
which for me doesn't make too much sense. But like it definitely replicates this sort of going through the history of the workplace. I mean, Frederick Laloux talks about like the progress of like organizational structures. A lot of them rooted in, as you were saying, like militaristic and religious institutions of strata, right? Stratificated. So you have it's a pyramid.
Right.
And one quick thing before I answer your question, I think there's this myth about this type of rigid hierarchy being quick, like quick decision making. It can be, right? One person dictates and then hands it down. But like if you read, for example, Gary Hamel, who's like, talks about a lot about management theory, his thing is like bureaucracy is or stratification is the enemy of speed. So if somebody's on the factory floor and something goes wrong, you got to go to our supervisor and get it approved and then go up the chain and then come back down the chain. By the time, that person could have fixed the issue, you could have already lost millions of dollars it could have been a loss, right? Because
Right.
so there's a limit to it, right?
Right.
If you fixed hierarchies lend themselves to bureaucratic structures, right? You have to have bureaucracy to be able to function as a hierarchy, right? Eventually, in a startup, it's people are closer, and of course you can just like quickly make those decisions. But as you scale, people silo, people kind of have different, and it doesn't necessarily work well. So it's not always that the trade-off is speed versus better decisions. It's like sometimes it's both, right? So that's one thing. Second thing is I think like it makes sense to appoint a single point of contact for the DEI stuff for an organization that is more so less interested in the work, because that you put the entire burden of an entire DEI program on a single shoulders or a team, then it's easy to scapegoat. It's easy to kind of like affix successes and losses and things like that to that, right? It's hard to have a very rigid hierarchy and have this kind of a more distributive model in an area like DEI, and then like people kind of will see that and be like, oh, this is working really well. Why don't we do this in other parts of our organization? And then that kind of challenges a little bit of the and this has happened before. There have been companies that have tried more distributive decision making in certain teams and departments, worked out really well, and the other departments were like, why do they get all this like power, and so it failed. They protested essentially. I think Hamill talks about it in the book Humanocracy. It was I think a cereal manufacturer that tried it at one point. So I don't like it. If it works, it works. Like if there are benevolent sort of CDOs that are really interested in more collaborative environments and create that atmosphere, I mean, that works. That's going to happen, right? Like, you have countries around the world that have authoritarians that are also highly responsive to the needs of their people, right? A classic example you'll think of is like Singapore, for example. They're very they have benefits, and obviously it's not all peachy, right? Like any other country, but it's not impossible, right? But I think it makes most sense for the DEI world where you're managing this high degree of complexity, and that complexity is not like objective complexity. It's tied to emotion, it's tied to history, it's tied to people's lives, and people attach a lot of feeling into that. That degree of complexity with such a highly emotional endeavor, which is the DEI world, is not suited for an individual to manage that. And I think that's why you see a lot of cases of burnout in the DEI. the average CDO has a lifespan in a company of about like 3 years, I think. That's very short, right? On average, right? Like, and so it's a very, very highly like burnt out like role because of the nature of how it's structured in the organization, how the power is distributed, like all eyes on them to fix this. But if it was more distributed, I think you have less of an opportunity for that. You find solidarity amongst people fighting for the, like finding common ground on the similar causes, right? Rights and justice and things like that. And it doesn't put the entire weight of the world on somebody's shoulders to try and fix this in this location, which is this company. And so like, so while I think that, this sort of more distributive power model, these models are much more better suited to DEI work. Unfortunately, I think we're still stuck in the trap of and I don't even know if leadership is the right word, but single power brokers kind of dictating everything in the DEI work. And so, again, I think that's partly because that's how the organizations themselves are designed. Hierarchy, and then kind of create other hierarchies. But like, I'm hoping to see a little bit of a change, not only for the sake of employees, but the people assigned to the roles of leadership in DEI. It's like, take some of the load off, right? And distribute the load.
And so I guess, what would you say is the most difficult part of implementing a DEI program?
The most difficult? I can rattle off a list of very, very difficult things. I think where most companies get stuck, and I can tell you a whole history of why this is, because I was actually just chatting about with somebody about like the nature of stunted progress in America, since the Reaganite era, the Reagan-Thatcher, era, and what. But like the way that translates to now is that the biggest holdup is this jump from planning to implementation, right? And so there's we learn how to decolonize our communication. We learn how to think differently. We learn how to we learn what biases are. We learn what microaggressions are. And jumping from that, we can do that on an individual level. Like we can interrupt one another and be like, hey, that's wrong and stuff like that. It's stuck in the communicative realm. It's stuck in the ideological realm. Like but translating that, those framings into structural changes is the most difficult part of it. And I think part of that is by design. I think like our, part of it, it is difficult. It's not easy. Like, for us, there's a lot of like fear and anticipation about like developing an experimental and iterative process of a DEI strategy that is also like has such, like we're talking about, emotional charge behind it, right? It's not just like, hey, it's not like computer programming, for example, where you can try it out. If it fails. Like there's so much more risk and at stake in a DEI program when you're involving human beings in their lives, that you're very much afraid to try experimental stuff and change things and move things along. And so that's probably the most difficult part of it. I think that there's a long history of this, and there's like this generational gap between older generations that are more willing to try a little bit, more willing to take action, but don't necessarily know, the best paths forward, and the younger generations that are much more ideologically aware of their oppression and surroundings, but like have this latent anticipation and hesitation to try things out, to make that leap. And so I think that we've had this issue where we've like progress has been stunted for so many decades in this country, in certain respects, especially on labor rights and things like that. That younger generations are looking for examples, and the only thing they can look for examples is in the past. And they go into reading theory, right? A lot of theory. They, experts and all of the theorists, right? Like, and that's great. But like, reading something 150, 200 years ago that doesn't have one-to-one applicability today. Like, you have to figure out how to translate that. And that translation from theory to action is nobody's taught younger generations that, right? And the older and I'm generalizing, but a lot of the older generations are much more, because of their upbringing, much more action oriented, but don't have the theoretical foundations to fight the type of oppression that we're trying to, dismantle. So I think like it's part of that trajectory, and it all just kind of fits into this like moving from ideas and ideologies to action is so incredibly difficult. Like developing a strategy, implementing that strategy, learning where to capture the data that something's not working and to adjust or to scrap and start over, and then vocalize the mistake. Right? It's a lot of difficult work that, frankly, a lot of people are afraid to do.
Do you feel that a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that are being conducted by employers is really empowered enough to be able to make a change within those environments, or do you feel like it's still not there to really, because you mentioned a lot of the turnover, right? So there's so much turnover. Is it that feeling that they're not able to get things done and that they're getting burned out by the inability of actually structuring the change that they want to kind of implement? Or is it that, it's just hard to do?
I think it depends on what you mean by empower. I think like there's a lot of empowerment in folks to, again, like communicate well, not try not to be as racist or as sexist or misogynist or ableist when you speak at work. There is less empowerment in the structural aspects of it, right? Like, and so like, people then kind of, there's like this cognitive dissonance, like, and I'm speaking from personal experience, like, like, as well as like professional experiences, like, how come like, we talk the talk now, right? Like we know all the right things to say. We're using the right words. Why does it still feel so oppressive in here? And that's because we're not deeply, interrogating the structure. The structure was built on oppression, and just removing oppressive terminology doesn't change things, right?
Right.
So I think there is and that kind of feeds back into this liberal kind of mindset of I'm going to do just enough that it doesn't challenge my power and authority, but any sort of deeper change is like, not in my backyard or kind of whatever.
Right.
And so that's where I think we are. It's like, yeah, like I go into places that I'm like, wow, like they're saying all the right things and stuff like that, and then you go into it and you're like, wow, they're still very exploitative when it comes to people's labor, right? Like, right? It's still like people are working like excessive amounts. They're not, but like, I see you, I hear you, and all this like, very DEI talk, like, and at the end of the day, like they're burnt out. So what happens is like, DEI ends up becoming just another thing to do, and people end up hating it because it's like, I talked about this in another podcast. It's like you're carrying the weight of multiple systems of oppression on your shoulders, and then somebody comes and says, okay, so we're doing this celebratory thing to okay, great. I mean, I would be happy to lighten the load for me so I can take that on, so I can take on different things. And so like So it's just like it's adding on top of it, and it becomes just so overwhelming and burnout like kind of stuff. Like,
Right.
and then DEI practitioners are trying to motivate people to kind of do more things, and everyone's already burnt out by the structural oppression that exists in the organization, that they can't like. But they talk well, right? Like they've learned that not to be microaggressive, which is wonderful. I mean, that's great for to reduce workplace traumas, but nobody's addressing like the systemic issues, and the same thing's happening in the field of psychology, and everyone wants to talk about individualized care and self-care and stuff like that, and we're not talking about the social determinants of health. We're not talking about the structural systemic factors that are going into the social stressors that are being piled onto me that's causing me to feel
the
this.
issue. Right.
Yeah. So the same thing mirrors in our organizations, and I think if you want to talk about empowerment, like you can't just it can't just be communicative. I mean, that's only a part of it, right? Ideological decolonization is a sliver of the like structural and physical decolonization required to kind of put our planet back on a path of healing and finding some balance, right? So
it's very it's good that you mentioned that. I mean, so tell me a little bit about your company. You're the founder of Critical Equity Consulting. Tell me a little bit about what your company does for different organizations.
Yeah, so I mean, I started off in the DEI world. Eventually I started looking into some things like a little bit outside of DEI. So now I refer to myself as an organizational justice practitioner and organizational justice practice, which I think kind of resonates with the podcast and what you do. Justice on a more like sociological, not like, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have any like legal,
justice is justice, right? I mean,
right.
Creating fair environments is,
exactly.
we do it in a legal sphere. I deal with the same issue in terms of systemic legal injustices that exist. So we work within the systems that exist to try to alter and change them. But I think organizational justice, workplace justice, pretty much this similar concepts,
Yeah, like taking basically like the wider concept of justice and localizing it into in an organization, right? And so it's a more local version of a broader sort of like push for it. So critical equity. I started it in the height of the pandemic in the summer of 2020. Things are good. Like we do a lot of very interesting stuff for organizations, from like data, doing surveys and analysis. We've done pay equity studies. We've done a number of different. We do a number of different types of trainings. A lot of my work centers around the concept of power in the workplace and how it's distributed, how it's codified. Is it fluid? Is it fixed? Like how we structure it, and then designing sort of inclusion interventions or equity interventions based on the structure of power, as you've determined in your organization, how it fits and stuff like that. And so that's why I call myself organizational justice, because I think it's a little bit deeper systemic stuff. And a lot of the work that I do is sort of like incorporating some of the more distributive power models, like some concepts around self-managed organizations, self-management. Like, I learn a lot from cooperatives and how they operate, and organizations that are doing really well on labor rights specifically, and how that integrates with good DEI practices. So like, so I think that's a little bit like different. Like it's not different, but it's like it is a little bit like a more synergistic area than DEI, which is a very specialized area. And so, so that's kind of like the structure of where we work. And so, we do surveys, we do trainings, we do ad hoc consulting, hourly consulting. If there's some projects that need to be, we'll help implement, boost up like employee resource groups and other mechanisms for representation, such as DEI councils and things like that, and teach how to manage things in a more shared collaborative environment to kind of extract the needs of the employees better, to
Right,
kind of
right.
learn the needs of the employees better. So.
Okay, wonderful. And so I guess in your practice, what are the top 3 diversity issues you've seen in the workplace? And why do you think companies struggle to address these issues?
One I mentioned, I think the top one was this well, it's related to this notion of ideas to implementation. I think there's a halt of momentum in the DEI practices a lot in the work where people are stuck. I've seen this actually in the past couple months. This has been really everybody seems to be very stuck now.
Right.
We've done all the work. How come we're not seeing results? And I'm like, well, this is we're not actually. We've learned how to do the work.
Right.
We're not actually doing it. So that's one. Second thing is this the burden of on DEI folks in an organization to or the responsibility put on their shoulders to manage the entire process, and there's not a distribution of risk, and there's not a distribution of the ownership of the DEI work, right? And so it comes on to it becomes an easy scapegoat to kind of put the quote unquote failures. I don't know if that's even the proper term, onto
Right.
a single individual. So
Right.
that leads to high degrees of burnout for the work, and it's also the third thing, which is related to that burnout, is a lack of, how do I put this? The way DEI is being conducted now, there should be some formality and some common ground and some procedural standards of operating in DEI work, right? And so I'm against that, but if you want to do traditional DEI, you have to have that. We don't have those, right? So now there's a lot of certificate programs that are coming up, trying to standardize it. Everyone's got different approaches and things like that, and it's very confusing. My appeal is so if you want to do DEI work that way, you need standards. My appeal is that let's forget all of that, right? We have some grab bag of things we can try, sure, removing demographic identifiers on resumes. Okay, let's try it, whatever. But my whole thing has been, in the absence of that, we don't need to standardize the industry, because we need some very flexible things for how an organization operates, right? If it's operating in it's unique structure, it's a unique body of employees. My appeal is to less so standardize things to do and more standardize ways of getting what people need, and so how to be able to kind of incorporate different voices, incorporate decision making, incorporate the needs and values of all of your employees, and being able to collectively move toward developing a organizational value system, and then operating procedures, and then strategies, and then all these things based off of this more shared collective atmosphere in the workplace. So the traditional DEI approach, I think is people are even DEI practitioners I barely know what to do. It's and I've been in this role, there's so many things we can try and people are trying out, and so many things people are calling employee resource groups different things these days, and it's all essentially the same thing. It's about representing people in the workplace, and it becomes so confusing, and that confusion leads to a lack of action. And then that plus the entire responsibility of actually getting something done, it's a disconnect, and it leads to a lot of failure. So I think fundamentally, for us, we really got to structure a process to be able to get the needs of the employees figure out ways to like use. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of great collaboration tools and a lot of great like meeting facilitation tools where we can decide collectively how we're going to approach this, right? And from anything from a small item to an entire strategy. And so I think that's where it's so that way, if we ever come up against any issue, like we don't know how to tackle this, okay, well, let's use the power of the collective. Let's dialogue about it. Let's go around. What about this? Use your 6 thingy hats or whatever, like kind of office collaboration tool. What would work from this? Well, what's being left out? Who's being left out? Which community is being left out? Can we incorporate them into this value system and then eventually the strategy and things like that? So I think that's where I gave a solution when you asked the problems, but I think that's where we're at right now.
Well, thank you, Farzin, so much for taking the time to speak with us. It was extremely insightful. My mind is going in a lot of different directions, so it's awesome. I'm thankful for your insight and for your valuable work. I know that a lot of what you do is making a difference to people by way of them really thinking about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how it's impacting our society. So once again, thank you for taking out the time, and thank you for your work.
Of course, and thank you for having me. This was a great conversation. I truly enjoyed it, and thank you for providing the platform for this discussion.
Thank you.